Rwanda. They helped him get into power. And for the longest time, President Kabila and President Kagame, I'm talking about Kabila Senior, Laurent Kabila, they were on good terms up to a point when the Congolese started speaking and saying that Rwanda has too much influence on their president and on the affairs of their country. So President Kabila and Rwanda, their relationships soured, and so Kabila stopped requiring Rwanda's help and support. And at that point, it has been said by historians and analysts that it is President Kabila now realizing that he had made a powerful enemy in Rwanda. It is Kabila Senior who now, realizing the enemy of my enemy is my friend, went and helped the Interhamwe regroup, armed them, and they became the FDLR. So the FDLR is a group that has always tried to get back power in Rwanda. And that creates a problem for Rwanda from international relations, creates a security dilemma, creates an existential threat. Hence now Rwanda, realizing that the FDLR, with the support now of the government in Kinshasa, were a clear and present danger to them, now Rwanda decided they are going to meet the FDLR with militias that were already present in Eastern DRC, the Tutsi militias that were already in DRC, and that is what became the M23. So M23 was created to fight the FDLR. So primarily, this conflict is FDLR versus M23. M23 creating a buffer zone so that they do not come to Rwanda, and the FDLR then being used by the Kabila Senior as a weapon to keep Rwanda in check. So I'm just super summarizing it, but then we'll get into the nitty-gritties. So from the time the FDLR declared who they are and the moment they started congregating into a force that Rwanda could not ignore, since then is when we've had skirmishes every once in a while, Rwanda crossing the borders to go and try and neutralize the FDLR problem. And of course, yes, there is violation of territorial integrity. Yes, there is violation of international law. Thou shall not use force in international law. But to be able to understand this whole context, M23 came up because they were not only fighting the FDLR, the M23 also came up because of some ethnic violence that was being perpetrated on the Congolese Tutsis within DRC Congo. Who was perpetrating these violations? The FDLR and other militias within the side. So M23, think of it as a force that is trying to protect the Congolese Tutsis, number one. And two, yes, granted, it has been used by other powers for other agendas, but it is there primarily to try and deal with the issue of the Congolese in the eastern part of DRC who are being marginalized, victimized, and not treated like citizens of the DRC. So here is my take and here is my analysis quickly, just to so that our listeners can try and understand this. The M23 issue can be solved within the DRC, can be a Congolese problem where the Congolese sit down and have a discussion on the Congo we want, and the M23 will disappear and cease to exist. And how is that possible? Number one, M23 in 2009 had been promised that they are going to be integrated into the Congolese army and that the marginalization that was taking place on the Congolese Tutsis would reduce. So there was an agreement in place, hence their name M23, okay? But that agreement was reneged on. So they were never absorbed into the army, and persecution started taking place within Eastern Congo. Hence now they regrouped and became a force that not only fights the FDLR, but also is opposed to the government in Kinshasa because they feel like the central government in Kinshasa is marginalizing the eastern parts of Congo where these Banyarwanda-speaking groups exist. So going forward, if President Kabila, for example, and he has said he would not negotiate with them, if he was to agree to sit down and talk to the M23 and table and list their grievances and agree to just listen to them, I have a feeling that we would start de-escalating and seeing an end to this problem. That is one way of putting it. Number two, the fact that Kinshasa views M23 as Rwandese and not as Congolese Tutsis, that creates another big problem because until they get recognition, and that's why I began by saying this is a problem of identity, it's a problem of security. Unless the Congo government begins by first accepting M23 are disaffectioned, are disgruntled Congolese Tutsis, Congolese citizens who have taken up arms because of certain causes. So how you deal with conflicts is by going to the root causes. Understand why M23 came up. If you can deal with why it came up, number one, that is one way of de-escalating the tensions on the eastern parts of Congo. And then, of course, granted, there is the issue, and I know people are going to raise this. What about the issue of plundering of minerals? Yeah, granted. How will the M23 or any of those other militia groups keep themselves alive? How will they arm themselves? Of course, they will plunder minerals because of weak governance in DRC. The fact that the country is so big that the central government is not able to fully control its territory. So these militia groups are going to come up and they will exploit these minerals because it is giving them an income, it is giving them a source of buying arms. And granted, they will not want to give space. And we cannot discount that there are extra continental forces and other countries who have armed these militia so they can continue plundering and exploiting the resources. So there is an issue of course, resource exploitation and these militia groups being the conduits and the avenues through which this resource exploitation is and looting takes place. But primarily, the resource exploitation from where I sit is a secondary issue. The primary issue is why did this militia big group called M23 come up? If it is true what they say that they are marginalized, their people are being killed, and some of these issues are being perpetrated by the Congolese government from Kinshasa, if that is addressed, we will start de-escalating the issue. And then, of course, then Congo can get help on how to guard its borders and prevent this exploitation of minerals. That is what I'll just say as a quick introduction and quick summary. So I've super summarized it, but we can go, we can digress, we can now start dissecting all these issues one by one because it's quite big, it is complex. This is just trying to bring our listeners up to speed on what is really happening in the DRC.
Thanks so much for that. As you said, it's quite a complex matter, and so we'll just try and dissect it as best as we can. Now, you said that the mineral issue is a secondary issue, but you've talked about that FDLR and the M23 and that existential threat that is there. Now, I'd like us to discuss a little bit more and bring it home for those who may not be understanding. Okay, yes, the M23 feel like they've been discriminated against. The agreement was reneged on and things like that. Break it down for us in terms of Kenya, why this matters, why a crisis in the DRC matters to Kenya. You talked about the international implications, security threat, and all these things, but just break it down for us why we should care about a crisis happening in the DRC. As a member of the EAC, why does it matter to Kenya?
Thank you. That's a very nice question. Whether the DRC is a member of the EAC or not, why a war on the eastern side of DRC matters to Kenya is there because we live in a complex, interdependent world, okay? Because of globalization and because of this complex interdependency, you cannot ignore what happens in another part of the world. It somehow directly or indirectly affects you. The Russian-Ukraine conflict occurred miles and thousands of miles away from us. Some people didn't think it mattered until we started seeing the shocks in the fuel prices, food insecurity, unavailability of fuel and wheat and fertilizer. So anything happening in any part of the world is of grave concern. More closer home, one of the biggest problems with the war in the Eastern DRC is because it involves three of now our neighbors. A distant neighbor, DRC, but closer home, Uganda and Rwanda. This crisis in the eastern part affects these two countries. And when it affects them, it affects us in one way. Number one, our trade is affected. The eastern part of DRC, Goma, Bukavu, that entire region, most of their supplies for issue of manufactured goods, They import through the port of Mombasa or the port of Dar es Salaam, but largely through the port of Mombasa. So when the Eastern DRC is up in flames, it means volume of trade goes down. They are not importing through us. Kenya is losing revenue. Let's think business from a business perspective. That is the first one. Two, we get a humanitarian crisis that touches our territory because the exodus of refugees who come from Eastern DRC, like in our Kakuma camp, there are quite a number of Congolese refugees who are running away from all these atrocities and all these crises and the fighting and the conflict in the Eastern DRC. So we get a humanitarian refugee crisis because these refugees now running, some feeling they will not be safe in Uganda or Rwanda, choose to come to Kenya. And under international humanitarian law, we allow them safe passage. We allow them to stay in the camps, and that in itself opens another can of worms. What can of worms? Not all of them are genuine refugees as they are running away. Some of these militia who are running away from, being pursued by the powers that be or whoever is pursuing them will run away and will come carrying those weapons. All right. We have porous borders. Not everybody gets registered. Some of them are going to come into our country. So we now get proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Whenever there's a refugee crisis, there's a country in problems, the security architecture of the region changes because now all the countries inherit a problem of an upsurge of insecurity because of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. And how does this occur? Some of the refugees running away because they are desperate and destitute will sell those guns cheaply to get money to buy food or to do whatever they need to do. Some of them will come with those weapons and eventually they end up in the wrong hands, thus increasing the rate of crime in the neighboring countries. So any crisis, any conflict anywhere, the neighboring countries suffer from that proliferation of small arms and light weapons. So we get high incidences of robberies with armed robberies, people using guns. Where are these guns coming from? They are coming from these conflict zones. And some of the bearers of these weapons are the refugees who are running away. Some are not genuine refugees per se, if you get my understanding. So Kenya needs to be worried because trade, okay? Two, the security, the humanitarian crisis. When refugees flood into your country, the UNHCR will try and do its best to take care of them. But eventually, the social, economic infrastructure of a country begins to reel under the weight of those extra mouths to feed. Our healthcare system starts straining because now we have, the physician to citizen ratio starts changing. If you have it's supposed to be one doctor to 1,000 people, now it becomes one doctor to 1,500 people. I hope you can get the picture. So the socioeconomic infrastructure begins to strain. So any conflict anywhere creates all this, and you need for business, for trade to for countries to develop in terms of trade. Remember when Uganda and Rwanda are embroiled or are affected by the conflict in the Eastern DRC, they also import through Kenya. So they will divert their resources to military uses as opposed to importing. So volume of trade goes down. So there is that whole cyclic ripple effect of why Kenya should be worried about what is happening on the eastern side of DRC. It may sound like it is far, but it affects us directly. Then again, touching on trade, remember during the reign of President Uhuru, during the last administration of President Uhuru Kenyatta, Kenyan banks and Kenyan investors went and began investing in DRC. So we have Kenyan banks, I remember Equity and maybe others also. Kenyan businesses went and opened up in DRC. So Kenya has a stake in the investment, a huge stake in investment in DRC. So Kenya as a country, Kenyans stand to lose when there is conflict and turmoil in the DRC, because now it means not only are our people's lives in danger, but our businesses and our investments are in danger as well. So if you look at it that way, that is how Kenya gets embroiled, and that's how Kenya gets affected by this conflict in DRC.
Thank you so much for
I
that.
hope that I hope that answers tries to put in perspective
Yes, it surely does. So there's the humanitarian crisis, there is the trade aspect. There are very many things that one needs to consider. And so we need to care. If there's a crisis in any part of the world, it affects the whole world. So that's very good. Now, Dr. Zach is really trying to join, but for some reason, there's some technical hitches. We'll continue trying to add him on as well as Hannah. But until they are able to successfully join, Dr. Gidoa, you'll just bear with me. I'll continue shooting those questions at you. Now, I'd like us to talk a little bit about the South Africa element in this DRC crisis and all that. We saw that conflict, not conflict, that back and forth between Ramaphosa, Kagame, and whatnot. Could you just break it down for us, what that connection is with Rwanda? You've explained to us the Rwanda connection here, but now how South Africa comes in, because they talked about, Rwanda declaring a war of sorts and things like that. So just explain to us that South Africa connection in all of this crisis.
Okay, thank you. So South Africa comes in being the most powerful country within the SADC group of countries. So we have the East African Community, EAC, we have SADC, and interestingly enough, the DRC is a member of both the EAC and SADC. So this is where South Africa comes in. During the Nairobi round of talks, when President Uhuru was leading and trying to get a solution to the DRC crisis, one of the solutions was that the East African standby force would be sent into the DRC, create a buffer zone, so that now negotiations begin, so that the M23 are not attacking the Congolese army, and the Congolese army is not attacking M23, as discussions are tabled and as negotiations take place. When the East African force was in DRC, the M23 went quiet. The M23 cooperated, and they felt maybe our grievances are going to be tabled this time round. And there was a semblance of order, a semblance of progression in the negotiations. But then this is where the problem comes in. Uh, Kinshasa began to view the East African force as if it was not a neutral party. It began to view the Kenyans who are in this force. The Kenyans were there, the Ugandans were there, the Burundians were there. Rwanda, I don't think Rwanda was allowed to send forces then. It was willing to, but it was not allowed. So it was Kenya, I think Kenyan forces, Burundian forces, and Ugandan forces. So when the East African Army, the East African Force Standby Force, was in the DRC, President Tshisekedi began to think that this force was not really here to solve the problem for him, or rather, it did not do what he expected it to do. He was under the impression that the East African Standby Force will disarm the M23 and fight them, and probably carry out a DDR program, just demobilize them and then disarm them. But the East African Standby Force did not do that. So President Tshisekedi became uncomfortable, and he said he wanted the East African Standby Force out of his country. Hence, because that is his country, that's a sovereign country, DRC is a sovereign country, we can only be there at the invitation of the country. The East African Standby Force left. The East African Standby Force left, but not all the forces left. Some few forces, the Burundian forces remained. There somehow, through some maybe bilateral agreement, the Burundian forces remained, but the Kenyan and Ugandan forces left the theater. He, being a member of SADC, President Tshisekedi reached out to SADC and told them the East Africans have not really kept the peace, or did not really come to deal with the M23. I want the SADC forces to come in. So SADC, after having their summit, agreed to send forces led by South Africa into the DRC. Now, the biggest problem with that, there's nothing wrong with that, but the biggest problem with that changeover was that the advantage that the East African forces had over the SADC forces was, number one, there was no language barrier. Ugandans, Burundians, and Kenyans speak Swahili. M23, being Banyarwanda and Tutsis, also speak that Swahili that we hear Congolese speaking. A bit broken, but there was communication. So it was very easy to come to agreement and to sort out many issues. You kick out the East African force and you bring in the SADC forces, they number one, meet a language barrier. So they come there and they believe their mandate is to come and do what the East Africans could not do. So immediately the M23 started viewing the SADC forces as not a neutral force, but as a force that has been sent to exterminate them. So there was bad blood from the word go. So hence the conflicts that began, that now culminated in what we saw some 1-2 weeks ago, where South African soldiers were killed. When the South African soldiers were killed by M23 in skirmishes, and they were killed by M23, remember, this is a theater of conflict. This all is fair in war, in love and war, as the English say. President Ramaphosa got angry. He got angry and he started saying that M23 are killing South Africans. And by extension, he now pointed a finger that M23 are only being able to do this because they are supported and backed by Rwanda. This is where the diplomatic spat came from. When now Ramaphosa claimed that Rwanda is supporting M23, and so by extension, because M23 are a non-state actor, Ramaphosa chose the low-hanging fruit. He pointed his guns at Rwanda, claiming it is the Rwandese support of M23 that has led to the deaths of South African soldiers. And of course, President Kagame shoots from the hip. He does not shy away from controversy. He shot back, and that's when we saw during the EAC heads of the EAC summit meeting, when he called out Ramaphosa and claimed that he went to help, the FDLR, his enemies. So what really has happened here is South Africa, of course, is smarting from the fact that, remember, South Africa is the big brother in the southern parts of Africa. South Africa was once a nuclear power. They have a strong army. But having been embarrassed by this non-state actor called M23, Ramaphosa, of course, was, I'm sure he felt injured. His pride was injured, and he felt aggrieved. But in his outburst, emotional outburst, and claiming that Rwanda is behind this, pointing a finger at Rwanda, I think is what now sparked this diplomatic tension, where now South Africa literally threatened and said, if any more of their soldiers are in problems, Rwanda is going to suffer the consequences. So when President Paul Kagame is replying and saying, we will see what those consequences are, he is daring Ramaphosa to bring it on, to fight me on the East African, in this territory that belongs to us, try and fight us. So that needs to be managed. I hope that is what SADC, that is one of the things the joint summit between SADC and EAC needs to manage, because we do not want to have South Africa, uh, sending troops with the intention of settling scores with Rwanda, as opposed to coming to deal with the M23 FDLR issue, which should actually be the main agenda of those talks. How the FDLR and M23 are going to seize as militia, as key militia groups in Eastern Congo. That, for me, needs to be the agenda of those meetings. So the bad blood, coming back to the diplomatic spark, the bad blood between South Africa and DR and Rwanda is simply because the South Africans have lost a number of their soldiers, and I agree and I accept all lives are sacred. But I think in the theater of conflict, President Ramaphosa should have been a bit more careful, chosen his words carefully, and probably try to understand better what might have taken place, as opposed to throwing words at Rwanda, because I don't think that helps the situation at all. If anything, it escalated the tensions, and that's why we now have what we are seeing right now. The heated exchange between these countries, and it's degenerating into something that is very negative for Africa as a whole. The picture we are painting is a very negative picture, though I understand that all these nation states are pursuing their own interests, but we are painting a very bad picture diplomatically.
Okay, thank you for that breakdown of that bad blood. I think that is quite clear. Now, I'd like us to talk a little bit about Kenya's AUC bid and how all that is being affected with this crisis. Then we'll go to the Trump administration and some of the things that are happening there. So briefly, could you speak to us about how all this conflict and everything that's happening around affects Kenya's AUC bid, if at all it does affect?
All right, thank you. I'm going to wax political here a little bit, but thanks. Within my purview. This is let me interpret. This is my personal view, and I hope everybody on the on this place understands these are my personal views. I know views are many and varied, and every view is valid. In my view, because this DRC crisis, in my view, has cost Kenya the DRC vote. If at all President Tshisekedi was going to vote for the Kenya, for Prime Minister Raila Odinga, we have lost that vote. Why? I interpret it from this perspective. When President Ruto, being the chair of the EAC, called for that emergency session of the EAC, and President Tshisekedi snapped it. He snapped it because he felt he's not going to get help in the East African bloc. He felt maybe the East African heads of state were going to gang up against him in support of President Kagame. That is why he snapped it, and he easily attended. One that Samia Suluhu called, because she's the chair, or I think the security a committee, I think within SADC. He attended that one, and he has said, we are yet to see. He has promised he's going to attend the joint the SADC EAC summit that is going to come this coming weekend. In my view, Kenya, in Kenya not being able to get on top of this in terms of managing the politics of the region. And how do we manage the politics of the region? From the time President Tshisekedi chased out the East African force, it was because in his mind he was already decided that the East African force is biased. The East African community is an old club. He is the new kid on the block. Remember, DRC, I think, is one of our newest members. So he felt he's not going to get justice or fair play from that block. If that is his mindset, it affects our AUC bid, meaning we have lost the DRC vote. That is what I'll say in plain black and white. We have lost that vote. How the EAC SADC summit turns out. If that summit turns out into being the East Africans ganging up against SADC, if there is no objectivity, every tiff where every place, every small quarrel, every diplomatic spat where Kenya is involved, that involves all these countries, it means less votes for Prime Minister Raila Odinga. That is how unfortunate this is going to play out to be. That is how unfortunate it's going to play out to be, because if Kenya appears to be supporting Rwanda, and now Rwanda has become, quote unquote, I'm saying this very loosely, quote unquote, an enemy of South Africa and an enemy of DRC, guess what happens? Now, South Africa and the people of South Africa can convince that Kenya is supporting Rwanda, or Kenya is not managing this very well on that eastern side. We lose some SADC votes. DRC is a francophone country, so we start losing the whatever countries DRC can convince, francophone countries DRC can convince. There go the votes. That is why the AUC chair position is such a high stakes position that diplomatically Kenya needs to be walking on eggshells right now. We are in the vote is just around the corner, probably 2 weeks maybe. So every any move we make outside our borders right now can only be positive or negative. And I think for the for our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the foreign policy advisors to the president, they need to tell the president that anything that happens outside our borders, and especially within the African continent, Kenya needs to tread very carefully, or else, depending on how it is interpreted, if it backfires or if it is perceived wrongly, remember there is perception and misperception, those are votes that are going. So, yeah. So, to answer your question, that is, I think we lost the DRC vote. Let's see. I'm hoping Tshisekedi can rise above regional politics. But these are some of the considerations that these presidents are going to make. If Kenya gets the AUC position, how will they approach my issue in DRC? Will they be for me or against me? Will I get help or not? On the basis of answering that question, that is how DRC is going to vote. That is how South Africa is going to vote. That is how Rwanda is going to vote. That is how all the countries embroiled in all this are going to vote, in terms of the perception of whether Kenya will be a liability or an asset if they get the AUC chair.
Wow. So it's quite a complex issue, and as you said, it's one to walk on eggshells on. Now, Dr. Chiliswa says he's been able to join, but I can't see you. But if you can hear me, Dr. Chiliswa, can you hear me? Because I can't seem to see you. I don't think he's on. Okay. We'll continue trying, but I'd like us to move a little bit to the Trump administration and some of those things that have been happening there. Now, US President Donald Trump's administration had ordered a freeze on federal grants, though that was temporarily blocked. But there have been a lot of issues, and Kenya has been one of those countries that has been feeling the heat. There have been fear of deportations, and the health stakeholders have been emphasizing the need for domestic health financing to break the dependency on that donor funding. We've had that issue with USAID, and you heard Doge, Elon Musk talking about reconstituting or just doing away with that USAID and why their funds are being used for some projects that they don't understand and so on and so forth. So I'd like us to break down that issue of the US and how it affects us in Kenya. So first of all, let's talk about the status of the funding of projects. Where are we now when it comes to the projects that are funded in Kenya?
All right. Yeah, thanks for your question. I may not really be an expert on all the types of projects that are funded, but I'll speak to just Trump's administration's move on number one, stopping or freezing USAID, or the threat that they are going to disband USAID and the projects that they fund. Now, USAID is one of the world's biggest, America's biggest donor to most countries, and in Kenya, it supports a lot of programs. So we're looking at Kenya getting affected from number one, that help that we get from them, that aid that comes into crucial projects, healthcare projects, development projects, you name it. So if there is a freeze in funding, you can imagine what happens. It means that some projects which are halfway or a quarter way or are yet to be launched, it means they will collapse. And the ripple effect, it means the people that were supposed to be supported will not be supported. So whatever we were trying to mitigate against, the calamity we will get. Two, look at all these, not only USAID, there are very many NGOs that USAID funds, that get their funds, and USAID is one of the biggest partners and donors. And these NGOs, I want you to see the ripple effect from an economic perspective and also from a social economic perspective. These NGOs not only fill a gap that the Kenyan government cannot fill, but these NGOs also employ very many people. With employment, you're talking about those are families that are supported by every employee of these NGOs that is funded by USAID. So look at that chain reaction. So other than just the funding and the project that was helping the community that will die, hence that community is exposed and becomes vulnerable, we have the loss of jobs. Okay, I'm looking at the loss of jobs, loss of revenue to the government by way of taxes. Looking at the Kenyan government will feel the heat in terms of it will be exposed. The gaps and the holes that had been filled in by USAID's development aid in various social economic areas. Now the government will be left wanting. So that means the public frustration in Kenya, public frustration will be on an all-time high, because if USAID was funding a project that the government did not have finances for, now those people will feel aggrieved. And guess what? They will not look at Trump. They will look at the Kenyan government and start making noise at how they have been abandoned by the Kenyan government. So expect, if this follows through and USAID is actually revamped or aid is reduced, expect a lot of heat within the socio-political, socio-economic life in Kenya. People will feel the heat. The government will feel the heat because it will become exposed. Areas where it was supposed to have filled gaps a long time ago, it has maintained its dependency on donor funding. And here comes a regime that decides we are not going to fund. So expect that. Number two, Trump's administration, if he carries out the threat to pull out, I remember I did not follow through whether he did it or not, to pull out the United States from the WHO Health Organization. That is not only disaster for Kenya, but for the globe. Why? The United States funds easily between 15 to 25% of the WHO's budget. We're talking about health security, global health security, and the risk that this one president's decision has, how he has exposed the world and particularly sub-Sahara Africa, how we have been left exposed by this one declaration. So not only Kenya, but many other countries and others probably worse off than Kenya. A lot of WHO programs, all right, the vaccinations. Think about vaccinations and at the very basic vaccinations for children, newborn children. All these things, when now you pull out all this funding and these taps dry up, what have you done to the population of a country? I remember I was telling, we were discussing this with my students somewhere in a course that deals with health security, and I was telling them someone should go to the ICJ, but the US does not care, and literally say this is a crime against humanity. You can't just wake up and cut funding like this or threaten that you're going to withdraw. And we looked and we did we did the math. The WHO's budget for every 2-year cycle is easily around $6 billion. So if the US cuts a quarter of that away, you're talking about $1.5 billion out of $6 billion being withdrawn. The shock therapy, the shock that the organization will go through, the restructuring, how it will have to adjust the lean budget now it has, is going to cause global health security, global health insecurity. It will be catastrophic. But more so now, coming back to Kenya, so we are not only going to be affected by the loss of funding and the loss of aid, we will feel the heat because those projects are not going to be funded. The socioeconomic upheavals that will occur with the families, that there'll be losses of jobs, losses of contracts. So you can imagine, so more people being made to face tough economic times. And then also, we now look at Trump listening to his inauguration speech. He also talked about America. He's going to pull out America from wars that do not concern it. I interpreted that to mean he is going to probably even reduce funding for missions which he feels are not directly affecting the US. And my fear was that he would touch Haiti. And if he touches Haiti, it means the $300 million that had been promised, there could be significant reduction in that. So expect to find probably the Kenyans being told to, if the UN does not pick up that mission quickly and convert it into a UN mission fully funded by the UN, expect the Kenyans to start packing up to leave or scale down dramatically, because the US will say, we are not funding this, it is not our fight. So those are some of the few things I can quickly pick up from the Trump's administration and how they would directly affect Kenya. Other than that, I'm yet to see how he's going to pronounce himself on AGOA, okay, which is supposed to renew sometime this year, I think in September, thereabouts. So, of which Kenya is an integral part. So, yeah, those are some of the low-hanging things I can, Claire, talk about how I see Donald Trump's regime and administration affecting Kenya directly.
Thanks for that. A number of good points that you've put there, the peacekeeping missions, the WHO and the health projects, and just that shock therapy. And I can see there are a number of requests to speak, and I'm going to open that up in the next 1 minute. But I'd like us to just speak a little bit more about immigration and Trump's stance on that and how that is going to affect Kenya. Then I will open it up to those who want to make their comments or ask some questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. On immigration, I remember I saw that list. The list that I saw had 1,232 Kenyans. Someone told me it had moved to 1,240. But give or take, 1,200 Kenyans at the risk of deportation. Granted, I understand all nation states act in their best interest. But I'm thinking about this as a double-edged sword this way. In as much as, yes, I understand Trump wanting to kick out all these immigrants, and some countries had as many as 20,000 people on that list. My fear now in how Kenya gets affected with this immigration is, remember, all of us know someone, even in this X space, all of us are aware of someone whose brother went 5, 10 years ago, has been there and has been steadily supporting the education of their siblings, supporting the parents. We get a lot of diaspora remittances, regardless of where the diaspora are. And since you have this list of 1,230 Kenyans at the risk of deportation or who have been identified for deportation, imagine the revenue flows that are going to cut. Imagine the lives that are going to be changed negatively because they have stopped working and they are sending the support back home. So I want us to look at it from that perspective. I'm also thinking about if he carries out the threat of deporting them, and I know a lot of international lawyers are probably going to start looking at this and trying to find out how to phase it out or how to beat this. I am imagining if, for example, you get 1,000, let's say 240 Kenyans deported, and assuming they are brought in the month of March into the Kenyan economy, and these were able-bodied individuals who are earning a living, a decent living, whatever it is that they were doing, I do not want to imagine the psychosocial trauma that is going to visit on the country and the families back at home. So Kenya is already we are already undergoing a lot of economic upheavals, and people are saying, things are they're not making, they're not being able to make ends meet. And then you introduce this extra group. The number may not sound significant, but the amount of money probably they remit is very significant to the Kenyan economy. And the affected families knowing that our breadwinner or the person who was helping educate the siblings has been brought back home, the psycho-social trauma that is just going to increase. That is the one side of the sword. The other side of the sword is, and this is if Trump agrees to listen to this, if he pulls out all of those people from the American economy, and these are people who are in very many sectors in the American economy, he's also going to hurt he's going to hurt the US economy in one way or another, because all these people, if they were not idlers, and I believe they were not, some were doing substantial, they were employed substantially, even though illegally, they were doing certain things that run the American economic engine. So if he pulls them out without a replacement or without a safety net, he's also going to expose his economy to some shocks, which I am not so sure whether they are ready for or whether he has counted that cost. So it's a double-edged sword. I know nation states act in their own best interest. I don't know what is pushing him in believing that this will solve American problems, but be it as it may, if it happens, those are the repercussions that we are going to get. And we've not even gone into the diplomatic backlash. All these nationalities who are being deported, how do you think the relations of the US and those countries whose citizens he has deported are going to be? This will sour US influence, global influence overnight. This will create more enemies for the US overnight than in any other, single-handedly than any other person would. This is the best way of spoiling America's name globally. When you deport all these citizens and all these other countries have this bad blood with what you have done to their citizens, America will not be in good global standing, in my view. That's from an international relations perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have added some speakers and I'm going to allow you to speak a little bit. Dr. Chiliswa, if you can hear, you can speak because I cannot see you among the speakers, but if you can speak, I don't think you're on. Let me just sample some comments here and then I will allow some of our listeners to make some comments. And as you're commenting, make sure you keep your language good and don't start any slanderous speech. Now, here are some comments. Wing Farm says geopolitics are a little risky currently globally. Everyone is trying to get whatever they can from the chaos going on around the world. Rugut says, I think the whole of Africa should be tuned into the Citizen TV X space to listen to the plain truth. Nakurian says, tuned in. Rugut says again, I have understood this conflict well and clear. That's good job to you, Dr. Gidua, for breaking it down in a very simple way. Lilian Sheunda says, tuned, clear explanation on the conflict. I agree on that. Fran Mdeleni says, nice presentation, very clear. I'm getting to understand the conflict now. Thank you for those comments. Yes, Dr. Gidua, a good job on breaking it down for all those who just wanted to understand it in a plain and clear, simple format. Now, I'm going to give listeners a chance to comment and keep it under 1 minute, your comment or your question, and I'll start with you, Buka Omole. Make your comment or your question in 1 minute, then we'll go to Vikmas. I can't seem to hear you, Buka. Dr. Gidua, can you hear him?
No, I can't hear him also. I can't.
Okay, let me give him a chance to
can't
try
hear
and
him.
reconnect. Okay, Buka, we can't hear you. Let's go to Vikmas as we try and sort your side. Vikmas, can you unmute and make your comment?
Okay, good evening. I hope everyone is fine.
Yes.
Okay, to start with Kenya's geopolitics and the crisis in DR Congo. As you know, the problem in Eastern DRC is a power vacuum, because when you look at the place where their capital is so far away from their most prosperous territories in the east. So I think when the capital becomes weak, then other centers of power might just rise up and occupy that power vacuum. Because for the Eastern Congo, you might as well think that the Kinshasa regime failed its people to some extent, because when you can't protect the lives and properties of people, they will form militias to protect themselves. And now, because you see in Eastern Congo, for example, a town like Goma is only 100 kilometers to Kigali, and then the people are of the same ethnic group, while Kinshasa is like thousands of kilometers away, about 1,500 kilometers. So you find that these people in Eastern Congo, their psyche and allegiance is to Kigali more than to Kinshasa. So that's why you find that Tshisekedi is having problems to control those eastern territories. And these are problems which were caused by the partition and split of Africa without giving any credence to the existing nations, because like the Banyamulenge, they are spread around the Great Lakes region, like the Luos spread around the Great Lakes region, but they don't belong to a single country. And you see, even in Kenya, I think if Nairobi will not be decisive enough, we might end up towards that, because how can chiefs, MCAs being abducted inside the territories of Kenya because our security apparatus are failing? So you can find that one day when the people of Northeastern decide to secede and say that Nairobi cannot give them security, they'll be right to do it. And you might find that they have their relatives across the border in Somalia, like the way Kagame is supporting M23. So we are headed to a very dangerous situation, which will not end unless Nairobi becomes decisive and defends every square inch of this republic.
Okay, thank you for that comment, Vikmas. I'd like us to go around to two more comments because we are time bad. Mungadi, make your comment in 1 minute, please.
Well, 1 minute, James is my name. I'm from Uganda. Remember, I'll comment straight about the problem in Congo. The problem in Congo, of course, would not be a big issue if we didn't have external influence, particularly of Uganda and Rwanda. Uganda has a very big hand in that because the M23 have been basically trained in Uganda. The Banyarwanda, yes, like somebody has said, the Luo are everywhere. And they have the right to claim for accountability and maybe government supporting them. But the ones who are fighting are trained basically to fight. And they can even come to Nairobi because we have been threatened already by the Banyarwanda of Uganda that if we don't recognize them, the M23 will come to Kampala. So it's a bit of a complex hiding within Museveni and Kagame. Of course, Museveni and Kagame claim liberated Uganda. And then Kagame moved from Kampala to go and liberate Rwanda. So there is that complex that is just rotating within those two people. The Banyamulenge or whatever in Goma have a right to be there as Congolese, but the fighting is within these two people. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment and for keeping it brief. Over to you, David Meta. In 1 minute, make your comment.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Thanks for giving me the mic. Two speakers ago hinged diplomatic relations and economic relations or affiliations with deporting or the deportation of Africans, from America. Quite frankly, I find that very fortunate because if we must continue to remain as some sort of a dependent people.
You seem to have dropped off, David Meta. Let me go to Claude. Claude, make your comment in under 1 minute.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. I will just briefly agree with the previous commenter that said the issue in Congo is external interference, a war of aggression and invasion by both Rwanda and Congo, with the support of their Rwanda and Uganda have invaded Congo, with the support of Western countries such as the US, the UK, the European Union. They receive a lot of funding from those countries, military funding. They serve as a local. They're basically local plantation managers for um, the resource plunder of the Congo. So the war is not about ethnic groups, and I'm Rwandan. It's not about people who speak Kinyarwanda being persecuted. It's about the looting of the resources of the Congo, and to facilitate it, Western multinationals work with Rwandan and Ugandan troops to do that. And then, of course, they've always used this trick of naming themselves these acronyms to kind of hide the fact that they are the national armies. But you don't see rebel groups in Africa that are this well equipped that look like a conventional army. These are conventional armies that are doing this bidding for Western multinationals in the Congo.
Thank you for that comment. I'll just take two more. Gaitan Dofanzo, in under 1 minute, make your comment. Then we'll go to Josephine, and then Dr. Gidoa will wrap it up for us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. Great space. Really quick, the overwhelming evidence that we have of Rwanda's and Uganda's presence, and particularly Rwanda, that it is not a personal opinion of President Ramaphosa of South Africa, like I've heard here, or even of President Tshisekedi. It is a documented, overwhelming evidence from the United Nations. So that's one thing that I wanted to clarify. That, like Claude's, my brother Claude said, it has been like for the past 30 years that Rwanda has been involved in the DRC in many forms, in many ways, but this time the escalation that we have seen in the eastern part of the Congo in the DRC has included not just military support, but actually providing military personnel and boots on the ground. The latest UN report talks about 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers with an additional batch these last few weeks that led to the fall of Goma. That's one. On the Kenya part, what I wanted to say is that the Kenyan people, I'm not even going to talk about the government, the Kenyan people, they need to understand that there is a shift in the way the West or the United States is seeing the Great Lake region. They are shifting away from Rwanda, and little by little, they are getting closer to democracy. And Kenya, as we have seen in the past few years, has been that example, that model of democracy. And that's why President Ruto was one of the, I think there hasn't been a president that put a fit in the White House from that region, right? The Great Lake region, long time. I don't even remember when it was the last time Paul Kagame went to the White House. And then when he came to Africa, when the US president came to Africa, they went to Angola. So Kenya needs to understand with the SHIP Act that they signed and the fact that they are a non-NATO member, if I could say, that Kenya has a critical role to play in the Great Lake region, and the President Ruto should not get himself dragged into identity politics that Paul Kagame and Yoweri Museveni has been playing for the past 30 years. That has literally done nothing. That has literally not brought peace or stability in the region. So for the region to be prosperous, for the region to believe in peace, it takes leaders some courage to make some decision in terms of like what we need collectively as African nations in the Great Lake region. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for that. Last but not least, Josephine Nganga, in 1 minute, kindly make your comments.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all the people. Yes, thank you. Actually, what I want to comment on is regarding our state as African countries in relation to whatever has just happened in the country by Trump holding funds. And I would say that we have ourselves to blame. Like in Kenya, we actually declared HIV a national disaster 1997. And since 1997, all the leaders who have come and gone, they have never thought about a better strategy how we can rely on ourselves. Personally, I'm feeling that maybe next time when you are hosting, let's host and evaluate ourselves. What are we doing and what can we do? Is it a wake-up call for us to stop relying on the Western countries and actually come up with our own structures to rely on ourselves? That's my humble request. Next time, when you are hosting, just bring that topic so that we can deliberate regarding ourselves as Kenyans and as Africans, rather than keeping on relying on other people and sitting on our own brains without doing anything. And now we are finding ourselves in very awkward situation. So many people have been terminated. You go to many hospitals, there are no employees right now because the government has stopped employing people in the name of they are depending on the funders and the donor funds. It's very sad. So we need to discuss that, and we need to discuss this sit as early as yesterday because it's very important for our country. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Josephine. I can remember you were part of our spaces during our open mic sessions, and I will bring another open mic session soon. I can see there's a lot of interest in this topic, as well as the unemployment issue. We had done that a couple of months back, and I remember you were also very passionately contributing to that topic. So look out for that. I'll be bringing in that open mic session soon. Now, I want us to wrap up this session. Dr. Chiliswa just wasn't able to join, but he has shared some of his comments that he would have given during this space. Let me just read some of it out. He wanted to talk a little bit about the Trump situation, that he is continuing with his nationalistic game. The cutting of funding is an attempt to reset international politics. On US aid funding, that's part of humanitarian diplomacy. By stopping aid, Trump hopes to use it to align allies and use it as a tool of trade negotiation. It's also a continuation of strategic competition with China. Thank you so much for that contribution, Dr. Zach. Unfortunately, this time, I think there were just many hitches on the space, but you are not able to join, but thanks for that contribution. So I'd like us to wrap this conversation with Dr. Gidua giving his closing statement. As many have shared in the comment section, you've broken it down very well, very simply for all those who didn't understand the implications of the war in the DRC as well as the Trump administration in Kenya. So just wrap it up for us for tonight.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me, Claire?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for everyone who's listened. My closing remarks is that, of course, my hope as an African is that peace will be restored in the Eastern DRC. And I like the contributions that have come from everyone. One thing I like about these spaces is that you get to learn a lot, and especially when the citizens or people who are affected by these conflicts are given a chance to speak and they set the record straight. There's a lot of propaganda out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but I also appreciate all the comments they've made. Mine is to simply say, let us keep hoping for peace. Let's wait and see what the summit this Friday and Saturday is going to come out of it. We wish our African leaders would put some of their differences, parochial differences aside, and really think about the Africans they lead. Ultimately, like what Josephine has said, it is the citizens who suffer. It is appalling. I did not even know that Kenya declared HIV a disaster in 1997. And yeah, the question becomes, what have successful governments done to try and make sure they have their alternative system of funding, or they can, take care, take the health of their citizens seriously. So we hope that all these things we are going to get solutions. Of course, my clarion call to all Africans on this platform and to everyone on this platform is, we just need to think outside the box. We need to stand up. We need to take our continent forward. We have the brains, we have the manpower, we have everything to make it happen. So let us be the generation, let us be the people who start conversations that are going to end this dependency syndrome, that are going to change and do politics differently. All right. So yeah, let's not view each other as enemies. I know I was in another space some other time back, and literally the Congolese and the Rwandese went at each other's throats. And who benefits when that happens? It's not about, it is some extracontinental force that has benefited from our minerals and from our oil and diamonds that benefits. So like African brothers, let's craft solutions, African solutions to African problems. Let's chart the way forward. And I believe we are the generation that will create and make a difference. So thank you for everyone who joined, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Githua. Dr. Hannah just delayed in class and wasn't able to join, but she'll join in a different space. Thanks again, Dr. Githua, for breaking it down very well, very concisely, and in a very simple way for our listeners. And thank you for our listeners for contributing actively to the conversation. I can still see there are like 11 requests to speak, but because of time, we may not be able to do that. But as promised, I will bring you another session on this and also an open mic session. So stay tuned for that. And I'd like to close this session for tonight. Until next week, same place, same time, 7 p.m. On the Citizen TV Kenya handle, also on my handle at Claire DUDIEU. Tune in for another exciting X space where we will engage on something else.